Christians are in agreement of, there's a whole lot of pain and suffering among our people. There are a lot of people that are upset. Anger and pain are about the only two universal things we've got in our country right now, as far as not being happy with where things are and what we've seen things be in our nation. And regardless of which side people voted for, you see that. Well, here's my comment on this. The church are to be Christ's hands and feet, Christ's ministers to this world. The great physician is counting on his disciples to heal and help the wounds of the people in our world. In other words, it falls on us to be the salt and light of this world. And if we do that, if you get nothing else out of this looking at the way the election went, you can recognize there are a lot of people dissatisfied. And let me tell you, there's no amount of politicians that's going to fix that. The only thing that is going to fix the ills and woes of our nation, of our communities, and our land is that if we turn our hearts and our minds to Jesus and we follow after Him and follow after what He has done for us and live for Him. And as God's people, we need to do our absolute best to be that light to this world. Also, if we needed anything to show to us that there is tremendous opportunity out there to be the light of the world, one thing you will notice is that when things are the darkest, the light shines the strongest. And if you did not think before that there's darkness in the world, I think this whole election process over the last year and a half ought to have solidified the fact that there's a lot of darkness in our nation. And hopefully we can come together, and I appreciate very much David's prayer for our nation to do that and to come together in that. So anyway, great thing about it is that no matter who is the president on earth or the king of whatever country, we have a great high priest in Hebrews chapter 7. And so that's where we're going to be tonight. So I wanted to say those things at the beginning, but I want us to go into our text and look at it and be so thankful that we can talk about it during our time together. We looked last week at the first half of Hebrews chapter 7. This chapter, I think more than any of the rest of them, helps set the frame, if you will, for who exactly Melchizedek was. And this tells us about, reiterates the account of Melchizedek that we saw in the book of Genesis. But what it also does is it gives where his place is in the history of the Bible. And of course, who he was is this. He's a king and a priest, a king called Melchizedek, which means king of righteousness, and he's the king of Salem, which is the ancient name for Jerusalem, and which means king of peace. And so he is the king and the high priest of this location. Throughout the Old Testament, there were no kings and priests being the same individual. They were always separate. And so what is unique about him is he's a king and a priest. Number two, we don't know where he came from. We don't know who his father, mother, and his forefathers were. And we do not know anybody in his lineage after him. So, now I don't believe for a moment that he wasn't born like the rest of us. I do believe he had parents. I do believe he had, very possibly children. But we have nothing recorded that tells us who they were and what happened to them. So very much, Melchizedek is just simply an individual that comes in one day, in one moment, comes in and he blesses Abraham, pronounces a blessing upon him, and Abraham gives to him a tenth of all that he has in a way to bless Melchizedek back. And then they part company, and there is no indication at all that they ever met again. And so it was a curious event, but an event that the Hebrew writer saw great significance in. Great significance in the fact that here is a man who is a king, here is a man who is a priest, and we're not sure where he came from and about his history and beyond him. And that's very much the way Jesus came into this earth. He came to be a king. He left this world to be a priest. And although we do know his genealogy, there were questions that people had about that. And certainly, especially, the duality of being a king and of being a priest is something that Jesus and Melchizedek shared. So, the Old Testament system of priests is one that is going to be is a beginning and a foreshadowing of what Jesus would be and of us being individual priests, but it is not the ideal system. The ideal system is of Christ himself. So, the first 10 verses basically deals with Melchizedek, and then he goes over into verse 4 and following, talking about how Levi, who was the head of the tribe that had the earthly priests of the Israelites, how that he was not superior to Melchizedek because Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek, and Abraham was what relation to Levi? Great. Because there's Abraham, there's Isaac, there's Jacob, and then Levi is one of the sons of Jacob. So it would be his great-grandfather. So he is an ancestor to Levi. And so you might make this the step, and of course the book of Hebrews is, that Levi, in a sense, paid tithes to Melchizedek as one greater because his great-grandfather did and did so. So in a way, Levi did that and acknowledged that the priesthood that Melchizedek had greater power, greater, I don't like the word prestige, but it was one that God had honored higher than even his. Okay, starting in verse 11 is where we'll be tonight. It says, "Now if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there be for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, for which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe Moses said nothing about priests." It was in that section that we ended up our time with. We started into that a little bit last week. The writer's point is, if the priest system with the Levites as priests was perfect, if there weren't deficiencies for it, then there wouldn't be a need for another priest to come along. And so, the fact that there were human frailties, there were individuals that, they would eventually die. There was the fact that the priests were human beings that were prone to sin and prone to have flaws, prone to have weaknesses, that it was an imperfect system. your priesthood was as good as the individual being the priest. And undoubtedly, there would have been better priests than others throughout time. And certainly that would be the case. When Jesus was on trial, you had a situation where there was Annas and Caiaphas, that they were kind of sharing the role of high priest, and like they were doing it for a while, and then the other one would do it for a while, and doesn't seem like either one of them was all that good. I mean, after all, they put Jesus on trial and pushed to have him killed. They rejected the Son of God, and so you were at the mercy of how good the high priest currently happened to be. Well, how could Jesus, who was clearly from the tribe of Judah and not from the tribe of Levi, which all of the priests were, how is he able to be a priest? He's a priest in heaven, first of all. We see that even clearer in the next chapter. We'll see that in that chapter. But he's the priest in heaven, his location. So his location is different. But two, he is not of the Aaronic, as in descendants of Aaron, priesthood, because those are the ones that Levi came about, and Aaron and Moses were from the tribe of Levi. So it's not his line that it comes about, but he comes from the tribe of Judah. And it's because he is a different priest of a different priesthood from a different lineage. He is after the order of Melchizedek. And that's the point that he's making.
You also, I think one of the points you're trying to make is that not only is it different priests, but when you have a different priest, you have a different law.
Correct. And that's what he's pointing out, that it's a different law. And in chapter 8, where we're going to look next week, he calls it a different covenant. And sometimes covenant and law are interchangeable, but even if you don't recognize them as interchangeable, it is a different covenant. God made a covenant with his people at Mount Sinai. Gave them the law, the Ten Commandments. Gave them the law of Moses. It is there at Mount Sinai that they received by way of Moses from God the plans of how to build the tabernacle, what to put in the tabernacle, the regulations regarding the tabernacle, how to build the altar, how to build the Ark of the Covenant, who it is that was to take care of those things, how it was that they were to take them down, set them up, how they were to do all of that was described to Moses, and they had to follow that. And if they didn't follow that, well, then God was going to be displeased with them. God struck Nadab and Abihu dead with fire from heaven because they were incorrectly using fire that God did not authorize. The King James uses the term strange fire, and the idea of strange is the fact that they didn't use it from the source they were supposed to use it from. It was nothing magical or mystical about the fire itself. It's just they didn't follow the process that God had said. Also, you have a man by the name of Uzzah that was struck dead when King David was having the ark moved on a cart. It was supposed to be carried by the priests, and so it was traveling in an improper way. And a man trying to do good by steadying it was struck dead because it was said no one was ever allowed to touch it. Now, clearly, there were men that built the Ark of the Covenant, but once God's presence came upon it, that from then on, they were not allowed to touch it. And so they were to honor that. They were to respect that greatly. Very much the way that we should respect certain things. I mean, let's face it. Most of us probably have keys with us. we know about what a dumb idea it is to take two keys and go to one of the electrical outlets around our building and stick one key in each prong. Why? Why would you not do that? Because you're going to get zapped, aren't you? It'll probably sit you on the floor. Because, why? Because we respect the power of electricity. You know, the reason why, if you ever see a power line downed, you don't go up and play with it. You know, it's not a rope. You don't mess with that. Why? Because you need to respect the power that's there. And the same is, we must respect the power that God has, that God wields, by doing what God said and by following His way. You've got to be respectful of it. Having electricity is one of the best things we've got, isn't it? You know, it is wonderful. It's nice having lights. It's nice having furnaces and all the things that we use electricity for. But it is a resource that you must respect, or you will have the consequences that deal with that if you mishandle it. And it's the same way with God. Having God's presence with you is the best thing you can have. But if you abuse and mishandle and blaspheme the presence of God by mishandling that, then you will suffer the consequences. And those that did such things as touching the Ark of the Covenant or trying to do things that they were not allowed to do suffered the consequences of it. Regardless of what their intentions were, if they did not do what God said, then they felt the consequences. Why did He say it was imperfect? Well, there's the problem. They couldn't live that law well enough to be saved. They needed there to be forgiveness of sins. The old law could pass it along, but it couldn't forgive the sins. And so they needed Jesus to come and die on the cross so that sins could be forgiven. Correct. And that certainly helped them. It helped make them better. It helped guide them in the way that God wanted them to go. But as we recognize, it did not forgive their sins. It did not do anything except for, so to speak, kind of kick things down the road until Christ could die on the cross. God did withhold judgment upon those that did try to do what was right, those that did try to follow the old law, that, people like Abraham and Moses and the prophets and the other people, the ordinary people that strive to do what God wanted. Well, I certainly believe that they would be saved. I mean, Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. I think they clearly came from a saved state. And so their salvation was predicated upon the fact that Jesus would die on the cross one day. They were correct. They had to try in keeping that old law, and they had to follow that old law as best they could with the sacrificial system. If they sinned or they did something, then they had to offer sacrifices. They had to participate in the Day of Atonement, the Passover, and those things. And as long as they did those things the way that God required, then they were able to, then God, so to speak, held over the judgment of their sins until such time that Christ could die on the cross. You see, their salvation was dependent on Jesus as well.
They did not do those things which would roll their sins forward.
Yeah.
Then it's the same thing as we would do today. We sin and we don't ask for forgiveness. That will carry with us.
Right. Yeah, if we don't seek to remedy that, seek forgiveness of that. Right. Yeah, so the old law and the old covenant, if it could have forgiven sins, then there wouldn't have needed to have been a change of the law. There wouldn't have needed to have been Jesus to die for us on the cross. And so it was necessary for that to take place in order, when he died, he died for the sins of Adam and Eve. He died for the sins of Abraham. He died for the sins of Moses. And so those are individuals that had already lived their life, but yet their salvation was based upon the fact that Jesus would ultimately pay for their sins on the cross as well. It took care of it as far as God holding it against them. Right. But the reason why the power was in what the priest did is because it was a mere copy of and a foreshadowing of what would be the ultimate sacrifice for mankind's sins. And so it was only upon that it came about. You see, God had the ability to still not punish them directly for that, and yet hold off his wrath for them until such time that Christ could die on the cross. Now, clearly those individuals that did not try to follow God's law and made no attempt to do that, then they certainly would suffer the consequences of being disobedient. The same as we would suffer the consequences of being disobedient against the law that we live under today. And so, it was important for them as well that Jesus died on the cross. Verse 15 says, "This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by a power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside, because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God." So, because of the inability of the previous priesthood to do what was needed, there needed to be another priesthood, and this one arises like Melchizedek. He becomes a priest not on the basis of legal requirements, but what is the basis for Jesus becoming the priest? Okay, God's oath. God's oath is part of that. God's the one that appointed him, as we've already seen in chapter 6, that God gave his oath, and about God not lying. But he appointed Jesus as the high priest because Jesus was given that position only after the death, burial, and resurrection, when he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. It is the power of an indestructible life that Jesus is placed in the place of high priest.
Luke 17, verse 17, writing there, you are a priest forever. That's basically God speaking.
Correct. Yeah, it is God speaking in the Psalms.
When God speaks, you have to respect what he says.
Or suffer the consequences, for sure. Yeah, it is certainly the case. Yeah. In Psalm 110, verse 4, it says that you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And that is a prophecy in Psalm 110 made about Jesus that it's quoted a few times in the book of Hebrews. And it's talking about him being that priest forever. And the thing about being a priest forever is it doesn't end. It is forever. And so what is so much greater about Christ as high priest? It is not because of legal requirements. It's because of an indestructible life. He is a priest forever. I've mentioned this over the last couple of weeks. What is so great about that is the quality of high priesthood in the life of the Apostle Paul is the same quality of high priesthood that we have in our day and time now. Because Jesus was the high priest in the first century. Jesus is the high priest in the 21st century. And so, we are not disadvantaged because of the high priesthood. In fact, the high priesthood is one of the great equalizers of Christianity throughout human history. You know, the high priest stays the same. And so, people come and go, nations come and go, languages and cultures and other things come and go, but the high priesthood of God's kingdom, it is the same as it always has been. And so that is a very, very significant thing. We know when it comes to elections that some leaders are better than others. And you're never quite sure what you're going to get till it's almost too late. Well, it's not that way with our high priest. Our high priest is the same, has been all the way through, and it is Jesus, the sinless Son of God, who is our high priest. In verse 18, for on one hand the former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. See, all the law did was point out wrong. There was no mechanism for forgiveness. There was a mechanism to appease God's anger for the time, but there was no mechanism for forgiveness. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. You remember that word hope in the last chapter, that we have as an anchor a hope that goes in behind the curtain that fastens us to the throne of God. That we have, our anchor is connected at the most secure place in the universe. You know, we know that if you're going to tie off to something, you want to tie off to something secure. You know, if you're tying a rope and you want it to hold, you want to make sure what you tie it to is not a blade of grass or a little twig. You want to tie off to something that's solid. A big tree, a fence post, or a rail, something that's strong. Well, our hope is anchored to the most important place, the most powerful place, the most secure place in the entire universe, and that is at the throne of God. So, what can remove, destroy, damage our hope? Nothing but ourselves. Exactly. When we are the only ones that can mess that up. And so we are the only ones that can do that. And so as long as we hold on, as long as we are trying to hold on, then we are held on to. So we have this better hope. And through that we draw near to God. Verse 20. And it is not without an oath, but it is with an oath. We saw that in chapter 6. We see that now again. For those who formerly became priests, who were made such without an oath, but this one was made as a priest with an oath by one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. It is stated again. And who is it that is swearing the oath? God. We already saw in chapter 6 that God doesn't lie. And aren't you glad that God doesn't lie? We all know that we are all sick and tired of political ads. And I would dare say at least half or more of that has all been lies that we've heard. We have been bombarded with a lot of stuff that isn't so. There's no way they can do everything they want to do. There's not enough tax money on the planet to do everything they want to do. Well, it is great to know that our God does not lie. And so the great promises He's made to us about salvation, promises about a home in heaven, promises about being an heir, promises about our high priest, promises about our new covenant, promises about everything we have in Christianity, it's all true. As great and amazing as it is, it's all true. And God will not change His mind. And I'm so glad of that. We can be fickle people. We can change our mind. We can, we don't say the same, but God does. God does stay the same. Verse 22, this makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Jesus is the guarantor. What's a guarantor? A surety or a collateral. A guarantor is someone that makes the guarantee. In other words, solidifies the deal. Jesus is the one that makes the new covenant happen. Why? Because what is the covenant from? The covenant is from His from His life. His death, His burial, His resurrection. His blood on the cross is what purchased His church, what purchased His kingdom. It was His death and then Christ being raised from the grave that made that possible. And it is when He ascended back into heaven, He became the great high priest. So Jesus, as we've already seen in this book, what do we see in chapter 1 Jesus was? Greater than. In chapters 1 and 2, He's greater than all the angels. He's greater than the angels. He's greater than Moses. You see, Moses was faithful where? In God's house. Who built the house? Jesus. Who's over the house? Jesus. So, if you are reading this as a Jew, and you recognize that Jesus is greater than the angels, Jesus is greater than Father Abraham, and we've seen some things along those lines, because his priesthood is greater than Abraham's. He was before Abraham and all those things. If Jesus is greater than the angels, He's greater than Abraham, He's greater than Moses. He's a great high priest because He's able, as we saw in Hebrews 4, He's able to sympathize with our weaknesses. He lived it perfectly. He was tempted in all ways like we were, but without sin. Because of that, we can enter to the throne of grace and find grace and mercy in our time of need. So Jesus is greater than the angels, greater than Moses, greater than Abraham. He is the high priest. He's the king. He's on the throne next to God. What's greater than Jesus? Nothing. Save God Himself, nothing is greater than Jesus. And that is the point. Anything with the old law is inferior to Jesus. And so, why is that so important to them? It's because many of them were tempted to stay in Judaism or go back to that. Why is that important to us? It's because when we deal with anyone who is outside of Christianity, this would apply to their situation. that Jesus is greater than anything they are believing in and following over. Also, this book, if you don't fall in love with what the Lord has done for you, then you really haven't read Hebrews. Hebrews shows just what an amazing thing it is. He's the guarantee of a better covenant because the whole covenant's wrapped up in him. Okay, we need to finish out this chapter because I do want to close it out tonight. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. What is Jesus' job for God's people? Make intercession for them. Jesus intercedes for us. He intercedes on our behalf. And he is on our side. You get in trouble with the law, and you go to court, who intercedes for you? Your lawyer, your defense attorney. Jesus is our defense attorney. If Jesus is your defense attorney, do you have a chance of getting off, so to speak? You got a real good chance, don't you? Because what's going to bring you to be found innocent? You're going to be forgiven of those sins. Well, how do you get forgiven of those sins? Yeah, because he is the one that can forgive those sins. He is our defense attorney. So when he intercedes for us, he is completely on our behalf. He is our guarantor. He is our intercessor. He is on our side. He is in our terms, our defense attorney. It says, verse 26, for it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest. Here is our high priest. He is holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like other priests, high priests, to offer sacrifices daily for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. What is the sacrifice that is offered? Jesus doesn't have to kill a lamb because he was the sacrificial lamb. He was the one offered up. He did that once, and that was it. The last verse 28, for the law appoints men in their weakness as high priest, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Jesus is perfect. The Old Testament priests were imperfect. They had to offer sacrifices for their sins and then the sins of the people. Jesus offered one sacrifice, himself, for all of humanity for all time. And he did so as a perfect sacrifice, the only perfect sacrifice ever. And he has been appointed in these last days as a priest, a perfect priest, a son forever. That is the circumstance that we find ourselves in as Christians. We are a part of that kingdom. We're a part of that with Jesus as our high priest. And so we will transition next week, chapter 8, to look at Jesus as the covenant that he brings is greater than the covenant that the Old Testament provided. And then we will talk about in chapter 9 that the blood of bulls and goats couldn't forgive sins, but the blood of Jesus could. And then we'll transition away from him being necessarily high priest to other things about Jesus and about what he has brought. Okay. chapter 8 next week, and there are outlines for chapter 8 on the podium in the foyer.